Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to do a short podcast on a perennial theme of ours, namely the extraordinary ingenuity and malevolence of the Israeli Zionist propaganda machine. Yesterday, as you know, and we did a podcast on this yesterday. The United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia declared that they would recognize a Palestinian state, and what it will deliver, that's a discussion for another day. Probably not very much, but obviously given the intimate involvement of the United Kingdom in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it was an event of some significance. But within the United Kingdom, there are very loud voices condemning Prime Minister Keir Starmer for deigning to recognize a Palestinian state. As I was saying, there are all kinds of ingenious arguments as to why this is so absolutely reprehensible of the British to do this. And the most ingenious one that anyone has come up with is that this recognition apparently will cost Great Britain some $2 trillion. Now you ask, well, how is it going to cost $2 trillion? There isn't even a Palestinian state to speak of. But apparently, this $2 trillion will come about because of the enormous legal liability of the British, and that the Palestinians will now sue Great Britain for whatever, trillions of dollars because of the alleged crimes committed by the British against the Palestinians. Now, this is all, of course, absolutely nonsensical. Now, it is true that the British governed the province of Palestine from, let's say, from 1917 through to 1947, for most of the time under the terms of the League of Nations mandate, in which case Britain was the governing authority, but it was a governing authority temporarily, with a view to eventually handing it off to independence, that somehow Palestine would be independent. The question of who would run Palestine, that was, of course, left for a later date. Now, during this time, of course, and this was really part and parcel of the British Mandate of Palestine, the British were encouraging the immigration of Jews because through the Balfour Declaration, and this was taken over into the mandate, the Palestine would serve as a national homeland for the Jewish people. It didn't say there'd be an Israeli state or a Jewish state. It would be a national homeland for the Jewish people. And the British were obligated to facilitate the creation of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. However, as it was said in the Balfour Declaration, and as it was said in the League of Nations Covenant, this exercise of sovereignty on the part of the Jewish people could not come at the expense of the non-Jews who were living in Palestine at the time. Now, of course, that really didn't work out terribly well, because as soon as the Jews began arriving en masse, the indigenous population took strong umbrage to it, and really almost from the beginning, there were tensions between the Jews and the non-Jewish Muslim population, largely Muslim, not wholly, but largely Muslim population. Now, the question then of what exactly what's Britain's legal liability is not an easy one to answer because, of course, the territory of Palestine had belonged to the Ottomans. The British had taken it off the Ottomans during World War One, but there was no real state in Palestine. So the British essentially exercised authority because they were the occupying power. And then, following the establishment of the League of Nations and following the recognition of the Britain as the mandatory power in Palestine, the Britain assumed responsibility for Palestine. Now, the problem was that at no point had anyone accepted that there was anything called the Palestinian people or Palestine other than a piece of territory that was taken over from the Ottomans by the British under the auspices of the League of Nations. Of course, there was no Israel either to speak of. Now, during this time, of course, the rights of the Palestinians were severely curtailed. First and most obviously, the people who were living in Palestine, the non-Jewish population, did not want Jews to be arriving there. However, that was part and parcel of the mandate. It wasn't just a British whim. It was actually recognized by the League of Nations that Palestine would serve as the location of the Jewish national homeland. Irrespective of what the local population thought about this. Now, during the various riots that engulfed Palestine, riots mostly by the Muslim population, they were obviously treated quite harshly. And then, of course, eventually, once a critical mass of Jewish settlers had arrived in Palestine, then it became really a matter of inevitability that there would be a Jewish state created on the territory of Palestine. But of course, then the question arose, how much of Palestine would be taken over by this Jewish state? And then, of course, there was the United Nations partition plan. And then, after the rejection of the partition plan, largely by the Arabs, but also, incidentally, by the Jews, but the Arabs were the more vociferous in their rejection. After that, there was a war, and then, of course, Israel seized a lot more territory. Now, the idea that somehow there is any kind of a legal liability for Britain is, of course, legally ludicrous. Because if you went down that path, then just about every people in the world would be bringing lawsuits against their former conquerors, lords, and masters. Just about every former colony would be bringing lawsuits against their colonizers. And of course, it doesn't happen. And none of these things have ever happened. And none of these lawsuits, and there has been talk about reparations for slavery, reparations over the slave trade. None of these fanciful legal theories will ever succeed. No courts have entertained them. However much it may be desirable, maybe one should go about rectifying past wrongs. But of course, the difficulty there is, it's an obvious one, which is, well, how many wrongs are you going to start rectifying, and how far back do you want to go when you start rectifying wrongs? So none of this is serious. There is really no prospect whatsoever that the Palestinians are going to go bring a legal action against the British over without question, sort of the hardships that they suffered under British rule, but the chief of which is obviously the creation of a Jewish state on that territory. And there, of course, if you um, have grievances, then the grievances should be addressed to Israel because it's Israel that was responsible for the mass displacement, persecution, and expulsion of the local Palestinian population. So now this article that's just appeared, it was in the Daily Mail, and its author is someone by the name of Stephen Glover. Now, I don't know to what extent um, people are aware of British journalism, but Stephen Glover has been around for many, many, many years. Really, I knew him back in the 1970s. He used to be an editorial writer of the Telegraph, really back in the 1970s, so it's more than 50 years ago. And he was one of the founders of The Independent. And then over the years, he's had a column here and a column there. I mean, he's a ubiquitous person. I mean, he's always there, writing a column about something. It's a very British kind of institution, which is the perpetual columnist. Simon Jenkins is another one like that. Weighing in twice a week on the issues of the hour. So here's Glover weighing in now on this $2 trillion in reparations that apparently Britain has now incurred. It's not at all clear why, even if Britain does owe some reparations to the Palestinians, and even if a court were to rule, I mean, all of this is ridiculous. No court is going to rule that Britain owes anything to anyone. It just doesn't happen. But even if a court were to rule that, it's not immediately obvious why the recognition of a Palestinian state affects this one way or the other. I mean, if Britain has committed a wrong which needs to be legally rectified, it doesn't really matter whether it's now recognized a Palestinian state. Anyway, here is Glover, and he says about this decision of Starmer's, Israel will be apoplectic and may withhold valuable intelligence it shares with this country. So the moment you read this, well, this is obviously a shill for Israel. Israel doesn't provide any valuable intelligence whatsoever on anything. Israel is a net recipient of intelligence, the intelligence that comes from the United States and from NATO. They have the serious intelligence capabilities for Israel. So this is the usual nonsense that Israel somehow is providing valuable intelligence about terrorists, the very terrorists that Israel is actually supporting, arming, and funding. Then it says, yes, yet as Justice Minister and former Foreign Secretary David Lammy conceded yesterday, recognition will do nothing to end the fighting and won't save a single human life in Gaza. All right? And then we have probably the most egregious upshot of Starmer's announcement is that it will take us a step closer to shelling out billions or even trillions of pounds to a future Palestinian state for alleged human rights abuses during what is known as the British Mandate. Britain ruled from 1917 until 1947 and struggled without success to hold the ring between Arabs and a growing number of Jewish immigrants. Our government proposed a two-state solution and then changed its mind in favor of a single state. I mean, what he's referring to here is the Peel Commission that recommended a partition of Palestine. That was in fact shelved by the British government, and then they decided that this would be it would be too difficult to draw partition lines in Palestine, and then they moved, yes, to a single state, but they also then published famously the White Paper in 1939, essentially ending all Jewish immigration into Palestine because it was just simply getting out of hand, and they had to bring some sort of bring in some restrictions on Jewish immigration into Palestine. But there was there was a moment in about 1937 that Britain proposed a partition. During the mandate, Britain was intermittently at odds with both Palestinians and Jews. In the late 1930s, Arab extremists were responsible for the deaths of about 130 of our servicemen. Now, the moment you say this, yeah, but that still pales in comparison with how many British servicemen were killed by the Jews, the Zionist terrorists. And then he actually, sheepishly has to admit that a similar number were killed later by Jewish terrorists in the dying days of the mandate. It is undeniable that the British authorities acted harshly towards some Palestinian militants in the so-called Arab Revolt between 1936 and 39, although they had, of course, been provoked. But not even the most deluded anti-colonialist or ignorant human rights lawyer could justify the claim that Britain profited from its mandate. History is now being rewritten to suit an anti-imperialist narrative. President Mahmoud Abbas, in charge of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank since 2005, has demanded reparations in accordance with international law from Britain, partly for the land lost by Palestinians. Now, as I think I want to show you in a minute, this is complete nonsense. It's a total misreading of what Mahmoud Abbas said. Mahmoud Abbas said reparations are owed to the Palestinians because of the Balfour Declaration and because of the essentially the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. But he didn't say it has to be monetary reparations. He said it's a moral case that Britain owes something to the Palestinians, and that's a different issue from saying that something like, that 2 trillions are owed to the Palestinians. But what Glover, and he's not the only one, but the Glover and the various kind of, I guess, conservative, right-wing Zionist journalists in London are trying to do is to create panic in Britain. Hey, we're on the hook for $2 trillion. I mean, 2 trillion pounds. They're going to demand all this money from us. What are we going to do? It's all because of Starmer that we owe this money, even though nobody has said that Britain has to shell out 2 trillion pounds. All that is being said is that Britain owes something to the Palestinians, and that what they owe is some action to bring Israel to heel. And that would mean some kind of sanctions against Israel. That would mean imposing severe penalties against Israel. And who knows, maybe even to exercise the responsibility to protect on behalf of the Palestinians who are starved and terrorized and blockaded by the Israelis. In no way, shape, or form is anything that the British may have done during the years of the mandate in no way is that comparable to anything that Israel has done. And so, no, I'm not now, before people jump on me and say, oh, you're defending the British mandate and whatever, that's just a part of history. It's over and done with. It was now, 80 to 100 years ago when this happened. There's very little point in arguing about that era. The question now is what's now on the agenda, rather than quibbling about what happened in the 1930s. But this is what they deliberately want to do, because they want to change the subject. Oh, well, let's talk about the mandate. Let's talk about the mandate years, rather than what do we do now? How do we address the horror that's taking place now, which compared to which, of course, the mandate years, are just totally inconsequential. Abbas has previously threatened to sue Britain if it doesn't apologize for the 1917 Balfour Declaration, and I want to show you that this is a total lie. The Daily Mail. Stephen Glover, absolutely lying. He has not threatened to sue Britain if it doesn't apologize for the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Which set out its intention to create a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine as long as the civil and religious rights of Arabs weren't prejudiced. Yeah. One could certainly argue that the British failed to protect the rights of Palestinians, but it is absurd to present the Balfour Declaration as an historical crime that necessitates the kind of compensation Abbas has been demanding at the UN, which of course he hasn't. The compensation he's demanding at the UN is the creation of a Palestinian state, a recognition of the rights of the Palestinians. That's the compensation. Note that Mahmoud Abbas, but again, this is the lie. This is the deliberately being done to whip up panic, in Britain, that somehow Britain's going to be on the hook for 2 trillion. I don't know how the hell they come up with this nonsense. 2 trillion. And again, and what you say, just by the by, is that none of these lawsuits has ever got anywhere because it's almost impossible to decide who is entitled to compensation. I mean, the original people against whom maybe crimes were committed are long dead. Their sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, great grandsons, great granddaughters. They may be living there, they may be living somewhere else, but it's not at all clear what, if anything, is owed to them. It's almost impossible to make these kinds of determinations. And so that, which is why none of these lawsuits have ever succeeded. It sounds fantastic. Oh yeah, we'll go and sue for the slave trade. Try get anywhere. Try to find what crime was committed against you, the actual plaintiff. The actual plaintiff has to show that though some crime was committed against him before he's entitled to any kind of compensation. Note that Mahmoud Abbas is the leader of the prototype state that our hopeless government is now recognizing. It won't be long before he's on the phone to his new partner, Starmer, insisting on an apology from His Majesty's government for past sins, plus a substantial down payment while lawyers calculate the final required amount. Yeah. Abbas won't be short of human rights lawyers in this country to help him. A group called Britain Owes Palestine is calling for an apology for alleged war crimes committed during the mandate and, of course, for accompanying payments. Yeah, well, there are all kinds of bigger people around who say these things. It doesn't mean that they have the slightest prospects of getting anywhere in the courts. And then he says a week ago it published a 400-page document drafted by senior human rights barristers detailing incontrovertible evidence of what is described as the UK's unlawful occupation of Palestine and its systematic abuse of the Palestinian people. Right, they did indeed, and I've looked at that, and interesting enough, has no hope of any kind of traction in the courts. No court is actually even going to take up that case. But the point is that what does any of that got to do with Britain now recognizing the state of Palestine? I mean, if you're going to bring a lawsuit, you could have brought a lawsuit at any time. Recognition of the Palestinian state, which doesn't even have any clear borders, recognition of that has nothing to do with the viability of this lawsuit. And then Ben Emerson Casey, is a former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, has spoken of the extent of British responsibility for the terrible suffering in Palestine and of this country's international obligations to make amends. Yeah, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about monetary compensation. How much money might be involved, no figure has yet been specified, but according to some legal experts, the bill for having ruled Palestine could be as much as £2 trillion. Who came up with this? That's a bigger sum than Poland is demanding from Germany, and the Germans told the Poles, to take, a running jump from a short pier. I mean, so and that, and there I think the case for compensation I think is a little stronger, but that's not going to happen either. And then here, our witless prime minister has strayed into another hornet's nest. Does he so hate this country in the past that he's eager to crawl on all fours to Abbas or whatever happens to be or whoever happens to be leading the nascent Palestinian state with a huge check in his hand? Um, in principle, I support the idea of recognizing a Palestinian state. In other words, I don't, but only when there is something that can be sized up before it is recognized. Is it viable? Will it be peaceful? Live in a state of harmony with Israel? Will it be a threat to the West? Yeah. That's right. But I love this, that live in a state of harmony with Israel. Would Israel live in a state of harmony with a Palestinian state? Um, and so on. Anyway, here is and then right away this has been taken up on Twitter. Some character called the British Patriot says breaking news flash. Palestine seeks £2 trillion in reparations to the UK. Already they're seeking it. Wow. I mean, that's amazing. Already, no, no legal action has even been undertaken, but already they're seeking 2 trillion. Following its recognition as a state, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas demands reparations from the UK for its 1948 rule, citing international law. This is absolute disaster. Wow. And where is Abbas saying any of this? And here's Abbas when he talked about the Balfour Declaration. So the first time he did this was in 2016 at the UN General Assembly. And here he says, by the end of this coming year, 100 years will have passed since the Balfour Declaration, and 70 since the Al-Nakba of the Palestinian people, and 50 years since Israel occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Yes, 100 years have passed since the notorious Balfour Declaration, by which Britain gave, without any right, authority, or consent from anyone, the land of Palestine to another people. This paved the road for the Nakba of Palestinian people and their dispossession and displacement from their land. And then, as if this were not enough, the British mandate interpreted this declaration into policies and measures that contributed to the perpetration of the most heinous crimes against peaceful people in their own land, a people that never attacked anyone or partook in a war against anyone. So clearly the real crimes were committed by Israel. He says Britain facilitated this. Now, the problem with without any right, authority, or consent from anyone, that's of course correct, but that's how it was in the colonial era. There's little point in rehashing that because that was the colonial era. In the colonial eras, the colonial powers took all of the decisions, and the subjects of the colonial powers had to accept those decisions. Now, you could say there's no right, authority, or whatever. The right or authority came from possession, that they were the conquering powers, the occupying powers. They made the decision. So there wasn't some divine law that existed there that could adjudicate on these issues. To the extent that there was any kind of adjudication or any legal legitimacy to what the British were doing, it came from the League of Nations. I mean, you can call that into question, but at least it provides some legal patina for what the British were doing. The League of Nations mandate, which recognized British rule over Palestine, a temporary rule, and which recognized and within the covenant, but also within the agreement, within the League of Nations agreement on the mandate that it would indeed be the location of a Jewish national homeland. But that was under the auspices of the League of Nations. So there was a legal basis for it, not doesn't mean that it was right or anything like that, but at least that was a legal basis. Therefore, we ask Britain, as we approach 100 years since this notorious declaration, to draw the necessary lessons and to bear its historic, legal, political, material, and moral responsibilities for the consequences of this declaration, including an apology to the Palestinian people for the catastrophes, miseries, and injustices that it created, and to act to rectify this historic catastrophe and remedy its consequences, including by the recognition of the state of Palestine. Yes, that's what he's saying. So he's saying here, we should draw the necessary lessons. It's 100 years since the Balfour Declaration. And he's demanding an apology to the Palestinian people for the catastrophes, miseries, and injustices that it created, and to rectify this catastrophe and remedy its consequences, including by recognition of the state of Palestine. That's what Mahmoud Abbas is demanding in terms of compensation. He said, you can compensate us for what you did by recognizing the state of Palestine. He's not presented a bill, hey, 2 trillion will do nicely. Not, I mean, I don't even know what that 2 trillion will be spent on, because at the moment, Palestine is being pummeled, Gaza is being pummeled, West Bank is being pummeled by Israel. So, but anyway, and then Abbas returned to the subject in 2023, also at the UN General Assembly. And he says, here I wonder why remain silent about the flagrant violations of international law that are being committed by Israel, the occupying power. Why isn't Israel being subjected to serious accountability? Why are sanctions not imposed on it for ignoring and violating international resolutions, as is the case with other countries in the world? Why practice double standards when it comes to Israel? Why accept that Israel is a state above the law? Very good questions. Is it not time to answer these questions? Is it not time? For our part, we will persist with our pursuit of accountability and justice at the relevant international bodies against Israel, because of the continued Israeli occupation of our land and the crimes that have been committed and are still being committed against us, as well as against both Britain and America for their rules in the fateful Balfour Declaration. Yes, Britain and America, and against everyone who had a role in the catastrophe and the tragedy of our people. We will not forget the tragedy. We will not forget the pain. We call for acknowledgement. We call for an apology, acknowledgement, and apology. We call for reparations. We call for compensation in accordance with international law. It doesn't really say what do you mean by reparations and compensation, and how are you going to determine what reparations are owed as a result of the Balfour Declaration. And so that's it. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this is that this story is now making the rounds in Britain. And so Britain, having made this historic gesture many, many years too late, at the very least 30 years too late. It should have been done at the time of the Oslo Declaration. That this sort of the Zionist movement in Britain has gone into high gear in order to induce panic among the British people that suddenly they're going to be on the hook for $2 trillion as a result of this recognition, and that this terrible, horrible, awful person, Mahmoud Abbas, who has been nothing if not complacent when it came to Israeli demands, is apparently going to be hitting up the British for this huge sums of money. Nothing could be further from the truth. Abbas was very happy that Britain made this gesture of recognizing Palestine. The last thing he's going to want to do is to piss off the British government by hitting them up for monetary demands. Everybody knows this. That's why it's so completely nonsensical. Apart from, as I said, the ludicrousness of the claim, because no courts anywhere have acknowledged the rights of former colonized people to bring suits against their previous lords and masters. It hasn't worked anywhere. It's not going to work now. So this is just a complete ridiculous story. But as I said at the beginning, the Israeli propaganda machine never sleeps. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.